I'd like to welcome all of you on behalf of Simon & Schuster India to the publication and launch of The Truth Pill, The Myth of Drug Regulation by Dinesh Thakur and Prashant Reddy. So I think almost a year back, when we first started talking about this book, we were having email exchanges, the authors, I was having with the authors, and right away it was very obvious that this was going to be a very important book, that what the authors were planning to say would be something that we all need to hear. And then, of course, I received the manuscript after a few months, and that sense got reinforced by how important this book is and how it was also very well written. It is very well written. It's deeply researched, lots of data, statistics, case studies, and but yet it's not like it's dry or quote unquote academic. It's accessible, very readable. But of course, back then, none of us knew, or even 10 days back, none of us knew what kind of interest this book was going to garner because of a very unfortunate incident, the death of 66 children in Gambia because of adulterated cough syrup manufactured in India. And in a sort of almost uncannily, our book starts with the death of 12 children in Jammu a few years back in a hospital because of adulterated cough syrup. So anyway, I don't want to take up more of your time, because I'm sure all of us are just waiting for the discussion. I'd like to introduce you to the panel. I'm not going to introduce Dinesh and Prashant because all of you all are here for them, and they need no introduction. Also on the panel, we have Ambarish Satwik, who also probably doesn't really need an introduction, but a few lines on him. Ambarish Satwik is a Delhi-based vascular and endovascular surgeon and writer. He is director of the vascular cath lab at Sir Gangaram Hospital and professor of vascular surgery, GRIPMA. Dr. Satwik is the author of the critically acclaimed Perineum. It's a critically acclaimed novel, Perineum, Nether Parts of the Empire. The book has often been introduced as a rogue and deviant, fictive, sexual history of the British Raj. His columns, miscellanies, and opinion pieces on a variety of subjects have been published in the Times of India, India Today, Outlook Open, Telka, Time Out, and Hindu Business Line, amongst others. Our moderator for the evening is Dhvani Mehta. Dhvani is a lawyer and a co-founder of the Vidhi Center for Legal Policy, an independent think tank that does legal research to make better laws and improve governance for the public good. She leads Vidhi's work on health and medical law and has a special interest in public health governance and healthcare regulation. She has previously worked with the Indian Council of Medical Research, the Niti Aayog, and an expert committee of the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare on pharmaceutical product regulation. So I'll hand the mic over to Dhvani to take the conversation forward.
Thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. It's really heartening to see that there are people here who have come to listen to and discuss an issue that should matter immensely to all of us. Most people in this audience will have consumed a pharmaceutical drug at some point in their life, and most people will have also consumed this on the assumption that this was not going to, at the very least, harm them, even if it wasn't going to help them. And this is certainly the assumption on the basis of which the parents or caregivers of those 69 children, I think now in Gambia, administered cough syrup to them. A cough syrup that was then adulterated, and because of which these children went on to develop acute kidney injuries and die. I think what we're here to discuss today is not that particular tragedy necessarily, but why do tragedies like this keep happening in relation to Indian pharmaceutical firms? What can we do to prevent them from happening again? These are the kinds of questions that are imperative for us to answer, and these are the questions that I think Prashant and Dinesh have been asking relentlessly for the last several years, and some of these answers are incisively presented in this painstakingly well-researched book, which is frankly astonishing in its depth and breadth. So I'm privileged to have the opportunity to discuss this book on drug regulation, or the lack of it, with the both of them, as well as with Dr. Satwik, who will tell us all, I think, and discuss with us why it is important for us to care about the quality of the medicines that we consume. So just to give you a brief idea of how we'll progress, we'll have a discussion for about 45 minutes, and then we'll we'll open this up to the audience for questions and discussions, perhaps even sooner than that, based on how it goes. Now, the incident in Gambia is obviously the starkest example of how issues of drug quality are literally matters of life and death. And India has had its own share of tragedy with diethylene glycol poisoning. I think Dinesh and Prashant's book begins with a heart-rending account of how 12 children from Jammu died because of this kind of adulterated cough syrup. Now, Dinesh, obviously incidents like this confirm your mission to shine the light on drug quality regulation in India and the problems with it. But I think it would also be good for us to start by hearing from you about why you thought it was important to write about this in the form of a book. Because there's obviously a lot of work that you've done on this in the past. What was the impetus to write about this?
Okay. So thank you, Dhvani, for coming, and all of you as well, taking time, away from your Saturday evening to come here. The genesis of this was a PIL that Prashant and I had filed in the Supreme Court in 2016 after what I went through with the Ranbaxy situation. I mean, that episode taught me that, we really had to do a lot of work to try and improve our drug regulation. And my first approach was to go see the health minister at that time, Dr. Harshvardhan. I went and saw him, tried to talk to him, give him a petition. Nothing really came out of it. And then, after that, I exhausted that aspect of it and writing many, many petitions to the ministry. I thought maybe we go to the court and see if the court intervenes and does something about it. Sadly, the court decided that, our petition was an academic issue. That's what the justice said. And they did not admit our petition. And so after trying those two things, there was nothing else left for me and Prashant to do other than educate all of us around here, right? The sad part of this is that we don't think about medicine until we really, really need it. Medicine is not a part of our general conversation every day, right? We have a lot of other things that we think about. It's only when we fall sick that we worry about hospital, medicine, right? And many a times it's a little too late at that point, right? We're at the care of a physician, good physicians, and sometimes even their hands are tied. I'm sure Dr. Satwik will probably talk a little bit about his experience with using medicine, right? And so the only way that was left, the only option that was left at us was to try and collect this data and present to you in a form of a book with the hope that you would read it. And you'd read it, and maybe you'll agree with, our conclusions that we draw from the book. Maybe you don't. Nonetheless, I think that you should read it, right? This book is data heavy. You'll see that there's a lot of research that has gone into it. Based on our understanding, we draw some conclusions. Clearly, we're not saying that those are the only conclusions that one should be able to draw. You can certainly draw your own conclusions. One of the things that we have done with this book is that we have put all the primary data that we've used in this book on a website for anybody to use. We really want you to do that because there's only so much you can write. You see, it's a big, fat book already. We want to make it even fatter than that. There's a lot more in the data that we've collected, and we put it out there. And so, long answer to what Dhvani, the question you're asking is that I don't know what else we could have done. We tried to petition the administration. We went and knocked on the doors of the court. And this was, as good an option that was left to us at that point.
Oh, absolutely, Dinesh. And I think what comes of this is, I don't know, maybe it's a lack of interest, a lack of understanding on the part of the executive, on the part of the judiciary. I think, your book points out how it's difficult sometimes to communicate the importance of drug safety and efficacy to judges. I was really struck by, there's a particular judgment that you discuss where a judge has passed a lenient sentence, like they do in most of these cases where the drug was found to have less than the prescribed amount of the active ingredient, on the grounds that, even if it wasn't going to work, it wasn't going to be injurious, it wasn't going to be harmful to human health. So obviously this is a flawed understanding of what the problem is with drug quality and safety and efficacy. So I thought, maybe I'd turn to Dr. Satwik at this point and ask if he could, break this down for us a little bit. What happens when a drug is not of standard quality? What happens when it doesn't meet the standards of purity and identity and stability it's supposed to do? How do we make people understand the importance of this? Are there experiences that you can draw on, in this conversation today? And how do we make medical professionals as well stress the importance of drug quality and safety? I know that's a lot to take on, but maybe if you could just begin by explaining the very basics to everyone here.
Thank you. Well, if ever there is to be a refurbishment of the phrase, the personal is political, I think it should be now. All of you should take this personally. This needn't happen. This isn't some, the African happenstance isn't emblematic of, how bleak Africa is. We all think there's misery and there's African misery, and this could happen to any of us. This could happen to our children. It has happened in India. It happened in Jammu in 2020. And if you were to just ask yourself, how does DEG, diethylene glycol, get into cough syrup? And what I've learned is from fine people like Dinesh and Prashant and journalists such as Priyanka Pulla, but let me just give you an idea about how it gets in. Let's say you're taking a cough syrup and the active ingredient, the regular garden variety cough syrup that you'll give your child, the active ingredient would be CPM, chlorpheniramine maleate. There'll be phenylephrine, there'll be dextromethorphan. All of this together would be like 40 milligrams. How do you ingest something that's 40 mg? You'll need to add volume to this. Okay, there'll have to be an excipient. There'll be something that will be a vehicle of allowing this drug to actually enter your child. And usually the solvent or the excipient that is added is something called as propylene glycol. Now, it's a colorless, slightly sweet, viscous liquid, which is what makes the syrup syrup. Now, propylene glycol, apart from being used in the pharmaceutical industry, is also used in a whole bunch of other areas. In the automotive sector, polymers and so on. And so the company that is sourcing propylene glycol has to make sure that it's sourced from a supplier that is providing human-grade propylene glycol and not industrial-grade propylene glycol. Because if at all there's a contaminant in the industrial-grade propylene glycol, it's not going to make a big difference. If there's a contaminant in human-grade propylene glycol, it can kill your child. That's precisely what happened. And this can come from ignorance. This needn't be malevolent. It's just a company that is going to source a liquid from a supplier, and the supplier isn't aware that, or isn't necessarily thinking about what grade of propylene glycol to be supplied. If it's contaminated with diethylene glycol, which is antifreeze, which is found in brake fluid, the amount of diethylene glycol that can cause toxicity in a child is roughly 3 to 4 ml. Think of the cough syrup that you'll be giving your child. Think of this as a kind of extended version of a game of chance, like an extended version of a Russian roulette every time you're giving a cough syrup to your child. And then you'll realize how much you must care about this. And this is an unspeakable tragedy, but it could have been easily prevented through good manufacturing practices that enable that. There are checks and balances that you buy from someone who's providing you human-grade excipients. And I must invoke that absolutely imperishable phrase from Hannah Arendt, the political philosopher, the banality of evil. And she asks the question, is it possible for you not to be evil, but to do evil? Okay, and as an extended version, she asks, or she says, that it's possible that almost all the evil in the world is as much because of ignorance as because of malevolence. And that it's not as though people who are doing evil are profoundly devoid of humanity and morality. It's entirely possible that these are normal individuals who do this for a variety of reasons, and all of those could be attributable to the complexity of human nature. So, what happened in this tragedy isn't a perversion of our national character. It's an expression of our work ethic and our national character. And then you must ask the question, all the people responsible for this tragedy, first-hand responsible for this tragedy, do you think they're differently constituted from us? They're people like us. They have their own set of incentives and disincentives, and perhaps the strongest incentive for any person would be reward, and the strongest disincentive would be threat of penal action, threat of punitive action, and the certainty of penal action in criminal prosecution. And which is why the absolute necessity for a regulatory framework, for checks and balances, for a set of rules that are absolutely inviolable and strict, so that the ignorant and the malevolent amongst us are forced to do the right thing because there's no other way of doing it.
That's really well put, Dr. Satwik. I'd like to take it to Prashant now. How is our legal or regulatory system evil through its banality? What is it that, why is our regulatory system not enough of a deterrent? Is it the book suggests that it's a combination of not having standards or rules that are stringent or precise enough, not enough regulatory capacity, and also, of course, the tired, well-worn excuse of a lengthy judicial process. But a common thread that does run through the book as well is that although there are criminal punishments that exist under the law, most sentences, when convictions finally are secured after years of litigation, end only in fines. So, why do you think, what is it that is not allowing the regulatory system to prevent these otherwise regular, perhaps not malevolent individuals from performing these evil acts?
Thanks, Dhvani. I could speak an hour on that question. But as Ambarish said, I think he caught the essence of the issue. Is it the profound question of Indian governance is always whether it's incompetence or just malice. And we're here, I think, again, it's a combination of both. I mean, one problem definitely what, we've been harping on is the fact that the government is heavily invested in the growth of the pharmaceutical industry. So even in an environment where we should be talking about higher regulatory standards, the government is talking about ease of doing business and deregulation in many regards. The other problem is, which is also common to a lot of areas in Indian governance, is lack of state capacity. The entire task of formulating, policy and the rules under the Drugs and Cosmetics Act is left to one joint secretary in the Ministry of Health who heads the drug regulation section. And these are officers who are, rotated through from the general pool of civil services. They have no specialization in drug regulation law. One of the joint secretaries just came from the central cabinet services, and he was dealing with cabinet issues one day, and the next day he was suddenly dealing with how to regulate one of the most complex industries in India. So state capacity is definitely there. And third, there is corruption, lack of opacity, lack of transparency in how the system works. I mean, if any of you just Google drug inspector corruption arrested, you will be surprised at how many cases you will find. So I would say it's a combination of all, but the second and third factors could be taken care of if there was a political will to crack the whip. And for that, you need to put public health over profits of the pharmaceutical industry.
Absolutely. And it seems, again, from your book that you think, I mean, that one of the ways in which to do that, at least, is to, well, one, generate enough public outrage about the fact that people are consuming medicines of this quality. But and part of doing that involves sort of shining the light on what regulators are doing, what pharmaceutical companies are doing. So transparency is key in holding, both the executive as well as the regulatory body and pharmaceutical companies to account. And I think there are many different ways in which this transparency can be demanded. And I think based on each of your, particular kinds of expertise, I have different questions relating to transparency for all of you. So one, I mean, maybe we can delve into some of the more technical aspects of the book here. And I thought I'd ask you, Dinesh, first about, because again, a recurring theme through the book is that there's been a lot of, there are problems with data integrity in the way in which pharmaceutical companies and clinical research organizations maintain records, generate data, demonstrate compliance with good manufacturing practices. So could you first just elaborate a little bit on why is data integrity important in the context of demonstrating that you have created a safe and effective drug?
Uh, so, unlike, other industries which make product, right? What we're dealing with here is a little bit different. What we're dealing with here is something that matters in a very sort of life and death situations, right? How do you ensure quality in that situation? Maybe Dr. Satwik can talk a little bit about when he's operating in the theater and he's relying, on a drug to do certain things. What is his confidence that the drug will actually work? And if it doesn't, what does it mean as a surgeon in that 5-minute, 2-minute, surgery that he's doing at that point in time? The way that we think about quality is very different, in our country compared to how the rest of the world thinks about quality. The rest of the world thinks about quality by design, meaning that when you make a product, you insert, steps in it where you build quality into the product, right? This concept of quality by design, which says every step in the manufacturing process has an element of quality built into it. You measure it. There are milestones in the manufacturing process, so that gives you confidence that the end product is what you expect it to be. Our laws, the way our laws are written, we look at quality in the end product. What our system says is that, look, the way that we measure quality is that the state will send an inspector to the pharmacy. That inspector is empowered to purchase samples of a drug, ensure its integrity, and we'll go through, if you read the book, it'll talk about the process and why it's riddled with holes. And we go through an analysis of that process, how it actually works today. And part of this is why we have so many, people don't get convicted, because on technicalities people get off because the process is riddled with holes. But the point I'm trying to make to you here is the quality for us is the final product. We don't think about quality by design. In that case, when we are only measuring quality in the final product, how do you sort of how do you get the confidence the final product is what it's supposed to be? Because remember, unlike your cell phone, drugs degrade over time. If they are not stored properly, medicines degrade over time. Even tablets degrade over time. That is the reason why on the back of the foil, it says expiry date of whatever date it is, right? Or if you buy the syrup that he was talking about, it says shake well before use. Why does it say that? Because the active ingredient sediments and settles at the bottom. So before you take that spoonful and give it to your child, the direction says shake well. There are instructions because the drug degrades over time. If you pick a sample at one point in time and verify that that sample is what it's supposed to be, how do you then say that it is the integrity of that sample remains for the period until the expiry date? This is just one simple example, right? The second thing that you're talking about is data integrity, right? The regulator does not have the capability of, state capacity, right? Manpower. We are severely short of drug inspectors. Even the inspectors that we have are not properly trained to do the kind of inspections. No regulator, doesn't matter how good they are, they're going to be sitting on your head at every manufacturing facility in the country to be able to look over your shoulder and say, look, are you doing it right every day? They're not going to do that. They will come and do an inspection once a year, maybe once or 2 years. How do you then make sure that for the rest of the time that the inspector is not looking over your shoulder, that you're doing right by the product that you're creating? This is where data becomes really important, right? That is the confidence that the drug inspector has when they show up at the manufacturing facility and say, can you please tell us, you've shipped 100 batches of this particular drug in the last year to the market. What documentation do you have that when you ship this product, right, that you tested it, that it complies with what the label says? Remember, anytime you buy a drug, you flip it over, or there's a drug insert in it, it'll tell you what's in it, right? 100 milligrams of ibuprofen, or paracetamol, or 200 milligrams of azithromycin, right? It says that on the label, and it also lists out all the excipients in it, right? How does an inspector know that it was actually 200 milligrams of azithromycin? Because there is something that was done before the manufacturer shipped that batch of product out. And that's what the inspector verifies. This is where sanctity of those records, sanctity of the data, and the sanctity of the process is extremely.
And this is, as you point out in the book, this is something that, is routinely a problem with Indian companies. And worse than that, it isn't seen as a public health problem. It isn't seen as a serious problem, but a minor infraction by the Indian regulator. And therefore, it isn't seen as critical to the quality and efficacy of the drug. So maybe, Dr. Satwik, if you have any, if you'd like to share, what are some of, the experiences of the medical community in prescribing drugs that turn out not to be effective? You spoke earlier about, and we all understand, of course, what the problems with contamination and adulteration are, but what happens when a drug simply doesn't have the quantity of the active ingredient that it promises to or claims to have, and what are the public health ramifications of that?
So when a physician or a surgeon will prescribe you something, it could either be like a branded drug, could be a very expensive drug, because that could be the innovator brand, which means that the brand that developed the molecule and therefore had a patent that lasted 20 years. It could be the most expensive brand in the market. And then there are generics, which are supposed to have the same active ingredient, but you have other companies that are allowed to manufacture that after the patent lapses. Now, you think that if you are to prescribe a well-known brand, you're safe. It's likely to have, if, let's say, paracetamol, 650 milligrams, acetaminophen, 650 milligrams. If you give a well-known brand, it's likely to have that much. If you are to prescribe a well-made local brand in India, you don't know that. That's because many of these well-known brands in India are subcontracting their manufacturing to some local facility somewhere in Himachal Pradesh. How do you know that an antibiotic, let's say azithromycin, like 500 milligrams of an antibiotic has 500 milligrams? It needs to be tested. It needs to be tested by a process called as high-performance liquid chromatography. Now, the largest pharma hub in India is in Baddi, Barotiwala, Nalagarh in Himachal Pradesh. 690 pharmaceutical units in this small industrial belt. It doesn't have even one laboratory to test for how much of the ingredients are present and in what quantity. That should scare you. There's just one laboratory in all of Himachal Pradesh which has the facility of testing this, and it's like a 20-year-old machine which malfunctions. It's absolutely not essential for you to perform bioequivalence or stability testing on the drugs that are being marketed in India. Correct me if I'm wrong. It's not mandated by law. If it is found by random inspection by a drug inspector that, well, the drug wasn't 500 milligrams as it should have been, but like 12 milligrams, it's called a not standard quality drug. And if the manufacturer were to be prosecuted and this were to be taken to its logical conclusion, most such cases end with a sentence that's called arrested till the court rises.
Simple imprisonment till the rising of the
simple
court.
imprisonment till the rise of the court, which means that till the judge gets up from his or her seat, where the defendant is to be imprisoned in his or her chair, and a fine of 10,000 rupees is imposed on the manufacturer. How do you expect anybody to do anything differently? You know, we've had instances where in the ICUs, we know that a certain brand of antibiotic is not going to have the desired effect. We know that particularly with drugs that have a narrow therapeutic index, you know, where you can't allow 100 milligram drugs to have 80 milligrams in it, it'd be dangerous. Antibiotics are not working, heparin is not working. In many cases, we've had anecdotal reports from across the country. An important anesthetic, propofol, killed a bunch of people in Chandigarh, in PGI Chandigarh. In state-run hospitals which are acquiring generic drugs have submitted a report that almost up to 10% to 15% of them are not standard quality, which means they're not carrying the amount of drug they should be. Look, I think you should all read this book and get angry. You know, drugs that are being prescribed for years together, like antihypertensive medicines or whatever, a metformin for diabetics, have excipients that are found to be mutagenic or cancer-causing in India. And these drugs manufactured in India and then exported to the US have been recalled because of an FDA order. But in India, these drugs continue to be sold by the same manufacturers because there is no drug recall law. So I think you all should be angry. You should stay angry because your sustained anger is the last and the best hope we have.
And hopefully that anger will sort of act as an impetus to the kind of legislative and regulatory change that we need. But before we get there, I mean, Prashant, if, continuing this discussion about the problem with proving that generic drugs are therapeutically equivalent to their innovator drugs, what are some of the regulatory, what are the standards that we don't have that can ensure this, and why do we not have them?
Yeah, well, one of the most important tests for establishing whether a generic drug operates in the same manner as an innovator drug is called bioequivalence testing. And this has been around since the first generic started entering the market. So, in the 40s and the early 50s was when we saw the first rush of innovator antibiotics and other drugs entering the market. And the patents were expiring in the 50s and early 60s, which is when this question came up on how exactly do we allow these generics to come into the market, because nobody wanted to repeat clinical trials. So initially, they were just doing pharmacopoeial tests, that is testing in the laboratory to establish that the drug was of the same quality and it was dissolving in the same pattern. But then in the late 60s, it became very clear that these tests, laboratory tests, were not sufficient to actually establish whether these drugs were dissolving at the same rate, because the dissolution of the drug is one of the most important parameters for the drug to work. So there were scientists who conducted tests on human beings and animals to show that generics that were being consumed weren't being metabolized in the human body at the same rate as the innovator drug. So you can do that by testing the blood and other samples from a patient and measuring that. And if a drug is not dissolving at the same rate, then you've got a major problem. So the US and the EU, the WHO, everybody knew about it. By 1977, the US FDA brought in regulations for making bioequivalence testing compulsory. We made it mandatory for a small sliver of generic drugs in 2001. And by 2013, there was a government committee which flagged this issue. Nobody took action. We had submitted a report again to the Ministry of Health. In 2017, they made it mandatory for all generics coming in, but the law is so poorly defined that the exceptions that apply, we don't know how broad the exceptions are. And because we've also got the system of 38 different regulators interpreting that same exception without any guidance from the government. But the larger problem, what we are really concerned about, is what happens to the generic drugs that were in the market before 2017. There's an expert committee of the government which had recommended a 3-year window within which all existing generic manufacturers submit bioequivalence data, because a majority of the drugs that we are consuming today are most likely have been licensed prior to 2017. So on that aspect, the government didn't take any action. So that is one area where we could have some reform, and the reform that we suggest is have a simple labeling requirement, like so that doctors know which drugs have been tested for bioequivalence and which drugs haven't. If the drug doesn't need bioequivalence testing, then there could be another mark for that. But doctors definitely need this information.
Yeah, but it's absurd that there should be 2 different sets of rules that apply depending on when a drug was approved, right? As in, so it's the absurdity of this should really be brought home to everyone. But even if there was this kind of information that was available to doctors and the medical community, Dr. Satwik, as in, do you think medical education equips doctors to understand this kind of information? Is there, is the medical curriculum rigorous enough to allow medical students to understand the I know they study pharmacology, but is there enough that allows them to keep themselves up to date with the kind of literature on drugs that is published? Even if there was this kind of transparency, how well equipped would the community be to respond to and act on this information?
Well, no, it doesn't. We in the second year of our medical college, we study pharmacology for a bit, and we study it quite badly, and that's why many people from our fraternity still end up prescribing the fixed dose formulations, which are completely moronic. But I don't think there's any attempt at explaining this to medical students in this country, and it should be done. In fact, which is why for me this book was an education. I learned so much about what people from my fraternity should be knowing about the manufacturing process and the testing process, and how to make sure that you're prescribing the right stuff.
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought up the fixed dose combinations, because while I was doing a little bit of research around this book, there's generally a lot of literature about how even globally half the use of medicine is found to be inappropriate. So, that's quite a staggering statistic. And then when you compare that with the hundreds of irrational fixed dose combinations that have flooded the market here, it's actually quite frightening. So maybe Dinesh, could you talk a little bit about why irrational combinations like this have continued to be approved in India? Of course, one way to stem their use is to educate doctors about how they are irrational, to have standard treatment guidelines, to promote the rational use of medicines. But an easier way would be to prevent them from entering the market in the first place. So how is it that the CDSCO has, how is it that it has allowed drugs that are otherwise patently moronic, as Dr. Satwik said, to enter the market and be marketed to patients and doctors alike?
See, this is a really good example to just illustrate the point why we say that this area needs a thorough fundamental overhaul, right? A law says that if there is a new medicine that has not been in a market, nobody's seen it. For the first 4 years, the approval of that medicine is with the center, with the central regulator, the CDS here, right? After 4 years, the law says that you can get that approval from any of the 37 state and union territory regulators, right? That's what the law says. Now, so that's one aspect of it. The second aspect of it is we have this notion called a drug price control order, right? This is the government's way of regulating pricing of medicines. We have a national list of essential medicines that the government says, look, this should be accessible to anybody in the country at a certain price, right? So the government comes up with that list and they publish it. And there's a whole bunch of medicines based on the WHO's definition of what national list of essential medicines is. But since those medicines have to follow that pricing, pharma companies are very smart. What they'll do is they'll add a vitamin in it and say, you know what, this is a new medicine. And they'll get an approval from the state drug regulator. Now we've got 37 of them. How the hell are we going to keep track of all of this stuff? Because I can go to a drug regulator in Goa, which has manufacturing facilities that make medicine for us, or Maharashtra, or Andhra Pradesh, and get an approval very easily. And the center doesn't really know about it until it hits the market, because that's a loophole by design in our law, right? And what does the government do? Government basically says, okay, we have this powers under Section 26A to ban what's in the market. That's like playing whack-a-mole, right? You get something up, you hit it with the hammer, the other one comes up the other way, right? You really have to have the power to prohibit these things from coming into the market. You can't be sort of playing whack-a-mole with a big, rubber mallet and then keep hitting.
If I can just add to that, so Section 26A was introduced in the law in 1982. That was the first time they issued a ban order for about 26 drugs, including FDCs. And with a gap of, 3-4 years, the government keeps issuing orders under Section 26A. The most recent being, I think, in 2019, when they banned 300 FDCs. So they constantly issue ban orders under Section 26A without ever addressing the root cause of the problem.
And these are promptly challenged in court, and that goes on forever.
Yeah, the last ban order, there was, I think there were some 21 senior advocates, basically half the UPA cabinet, because all the ministers had come back to the bar, and there were about 180 lawyers on the judgment sheet. The case went all the way from the High Court to the Supreme Court, then it came back. It was a complete mess.
Yeah, and those medicines, this continues to be challenged in court, and we don't have a final resolution to an issue that several expert committees have, applied their mind to and said that, these are not medicines that should be available in the market.
If I can add another anecdote, now when the government knows that this is a problem, instead of just changing the law and fixing how these guys get onto the market, they set the CBI upon some poor drug controller in Pondicherry, saying that this is a corruption case because otherwise the central government would have gotten revenue for 5 different drugs. So now you have given one license here because all those 5 drugs are combined in one FDC, and hence loss of revenue to the state. And they filed corruption cases against 5 companies in the drug control, which is quite a funny way of handling such a serious problem.
And as you point out in your book, there's also a lot of opacity about how this was handled, right? So there was, and to come back to my question about transparency and the need for it, while they were investigating how some of these dubious fixed dose combinations got their approval, there was an inquiry committee report that hasn't seen the light of day, or the relevant parts of it have not seen the light of day. So, in the context of that, Prashant, Dinesh, would you like to talk a little bit about what, the lengths you went to get some of the data that you needed for this book? What were some of the methods you had to employ, and how the bureaucracy managed to frustrate you?
Oh yeah, there was a lot of frustration over the last few years. So there was one particularly interesting story is this inquiry report. So in 2012, there was a parliamentary standing committee report which had completely flogged the national drug regulator for the manner in which it was granting approvals. So the Ministry of Health promises that we'll investigate how this happened, and it promptly asks the Drug Controller General's office to set up an inquiry committee, not thinking that the Drug Controller General's office was the office responsible for granting these approvals in the first place. Now, because of this, there was a long chain of communication from the DCGI to the Ministry to Parliament, and somewhere over there, the Ministry appears to have either not been told or it was consciously withheld from it that an inquiry committee was set up in 2013 and had submitted a report. So in our first round of RTIs which we were filed for the PILs, the Ministry of Health told us that there is no such inquiry committee report. Then when we started researching for this book, we had a really smart RA, Balaji Subramaniam, who found out from somewhere that this committee was in fact set up. And when we filed an RTI asking the government for a copy of the report, we got the reply saying that this is not traceable from the DCGI's office. And then the Ministry of Health, we asked the Ministry of Health, I mean, you told Parliament this committee is going to be set up. The committee apparently was set up. Where's the report? The ministry had no idea that the committee was set up or there was a report at all. We filed an appeal to the first appellate authority within the CDSCO, that's the DCGI's office. And even they say not traceable. Then we filed an appeal to the Central Information Commission, and it takes almost 2 years to get a hearing. So during the pandemic, just after the first lockdown, we had a hearing over WhatsApp. But about 15 hours before that hearing, the DCGI's office miraculously found a copy of that report from one of the authors, Professor Mohapatra, who had authored the report. And they sent a copy of the report to us. It wasn't signed. The annexures weren't there to the report. The annexures were copies of the actual drug approval files, which should have had the file notings, etc., of who exactly was involved in the process. So it took us 2 years to get it, and we're still fighting in the Delhi High Court to get a copy of the annexures. So at the last hearing, the government finally conceded that they have lost the annexures. The judge has put them in a tough position by asking them to file an affidavit. And whoever files that affidavit admitting that those files were missing, we intend to start another set of proceedings under the Public Records Act, because missing files are again a criminal offense under the law. There at least has to be an inquiry. So this was one of the tougher stories, but the more irritating stories are, where we'd ask for simple information on, we filed it with the state drug controllers, asking them how many prosecutions have you conducted under Drugs and Cosmetics Act? And they have the information. We definitely know they have the information because they need to sanction prosecutions, the headquarters. They transfer it to every district in the state. And then from every district, you get different answers. Some of these drug inspectors say, too much information, why don't you come and inspect our files? I mean, if we had actually done that, this project would have never gotten over, so we had to give up.
No, it's astounding the amount of data you've managed to gather despite all of these obstacles. So just to get a sense of how this would, how transparent, I mean, if I had to contrast this with how the US FDA works, what are the kinds of transparency measures that are in place? And how are they used by civil society and, the common citizen or the medical community to educate themselves about pharmaceuticals?
So I'll give you two examples, and hopefully this, will be relatable to you, because one is very, very fresh. Just think about how, we approved vaccines, in India. What kind of deliberations were held when, our manufacturers essentially filed an application for authorization, and what kind of information was disclosed publicly, right? When the US FDA approved vaccines, right, they actually held an open inquiry. There were 12 experts that did hire. It was, people could dial in and essentially listen exactly to what was happening. Each expert went through the data. They sent the data ahead of time of the trial data, 65,000 patients. Every expert got to ask questions. The questions were answered. At the end of the day, there was a public vote, and that's how they decided. I think one expert went against it, 11 voted for it, and that's how the vaccine was approved. In our case, we asked the same question, right? They said, can you tell us exactly how you evaluated the data for Covaxin? They said, well, go look at the subject expert committee report on our CDSCO website. And if you go look at it, there is one line in that table contains about 180 words, about 200 words, okay? And it just says nothing, absolutely nothing about, how the process actually worked. And so that's one example. The second example is a few months ago, the World Health Organization has issued a notice to all the member countries not to purchase Covaxin anymore because they say that there are manufacturing problems with Covaxin. They said that we conducted an inspection of the manufacturing facility of Bharat Biotech along with the National Drug Regulator, CDSCO. And based on that inspection, we are advising our member countries not to procure Covaxin from Bharat Biotech until those issues are resolved. We asked the World Health Organization to tell us, what is it that you found in your inspections? And they say, well, we can't really tell you because we are protected by confidentiality with the national regulator. Go talk to your national regulator and then, find out. They will be able to tell you. The CDSCO doesn't even want to entertain that question. And we are continuing to give Covaxin as a booster dose even today. Now, what transparency are we talking about?
Absolutely. And Dr. Satwik, this must have been a real problem during the pandemic, right? Isn't this, in any case, everyone is doing things on the fly. To top it, there's little to no information about how drugs are being approved. And there are Ayurvedic cures being peddled as well to, make up for the lack of allopathic solutions. So, how difficult was it for the medical community to come up with standard treatment guidelines at this kind of time? And I'm aware that it would be good to have audience questions as well. So it would be good if we could also speak about AYUSH drugs in this context and what the experience of the medical fraternity has been with them.
Sure, but just to add to what Dinesh said, whose interests are being guarded by the CDSCO? Where should the loyalty of the CDSCO be? It should be with the citizens of this country. If there's been an egregious or a not so egregious problem identified with a manufacturing facility, why should that not be conveyed to the people? About during COVID, we had issues with remdesivir, which Priyanka Pulla wrote about. And you've got a drug that was manufactured by a facility. A laboratory in Bihar identifies that there are bacterial endotoxins in a certain batch. The manufacturing facility is in Gujarat. This information is conveyed to the drug regulator of Gujarat. No action is taken. The drug is not recalled. And there are lives being lost as this is unraveling with the use of this drug. AYUSH. Look, I think first of all, there seems to be this notion that what is a chemical? A lot of people seem to be, having this idea that mainstream modern medicine is a chemical and the other side is herbs. A chemical is a substance that has a defined composition. What that means is that it's always made up of the same stuff. That's all it means. Okay? It means that there are chemicals all around us. In what we eat, water, H2O, is a chemical. In what we wear, there are chemicals inside of our cells. Chemistry is a study of the behavior and properties of matter. That's all chemistry is. So I think there seems to be this falsity that has infected society that, mainstream modern medicine is just chemicals and the other is just herbs, that we need to somehow eliminate. Now, a lot of people believe that Ayurveda is pseudoscience. And they believe it is pseudoscience because they don't follow the scientific method. All right? The Ayurvedic establishment believes that all the preparations and all the theories that they have been handed down. There's the ancient wisdom of Maharishis and yogis, and it's been handed down over thousands of years, and it is divinely ordained, and it is unfalsifiable. It's unfalsifiable. It can't be wrong. and therefore it should not be open to public scrutiny and should be immune from criticism. Now that is not the scientific method. Perhaps the most salient feature of the scientific method is to be open to falsification, to confront and embrace falsification. Now, Ayurveda and evidence-based medicine are incommensurable, and primarily also because of the understanding of physiology in Ayurveda. If you truly believe that semen comes from bone marrow and that blood is manufactured in the stomach, and that you can cure varicose veins by applying leeches, then that, I think, is a fundamental lack of understanding of what human physiology is as we know it. So show us the evidence that semen comes from bone marrow, and then we'll talk. And so the problem with Ayush medicines has been identified on many occasions. First, there isn't a standard pharmacopoeia, which means nobody knows what's in it and how it is to be tested and they're being manufactured in a modern format now, in the form of a pill and a tablet and a capsule. What the dissolution time is, that's number one. Number two, there have been at least 2 reports published in the JAMA which said that 20% of Ayurvedic medicines have heavy metals. Enormously toxic. And third is the spurious introduction of actual modern medicines in the guise of Ayush medicines to make them more efficacious. So these are the least shocking bits about Ayurveda, I'd say.
And the problem, I mean, is it really would it be difficult to create the kind of pharmacopoeia for Ayurvedic medicines that we have for allopathic ones? Is this something we should strive for in our quest to regulate them?
No, so look, over the last decade, and we document this in the book, we've spent 17,000 crores on AYUSH. It's not a small number. I mean, for a country like ours, and this is just purely on research labs, okay? Just funding research in AYUSH. 17,000 crores. And they haven't produced anything meaningful, and we document that in our AYUSH chapters. But the question I'm asking is, that Dhvani is asking is, can that money be repurposed to make something more meaningful, right? Something that stands the scrutiny of a scientific inquiry. Scientific inquiry basically says, what do we know how it works? Can we prove it in a lab? Can we develop clinical evidence to say that whatever that you're prescribing actually works the way it's supposed to work? For a country of our standing in the world, 17,000 crores pumped into CSIR labs to try and promote AYUSH labs, to essentially sort of, not CSIR, AYUSH labs, to be able to generate, or discover and develop these medicines, which are then marketed with the CSIR logo, giving them the credibility of modern science. It's fooling people, right? And that's basically what we are trying to say, is that we could develop better techniques, right? Better methods, make it stand up to modern scientific inquiry, and then we can say with confidence that these things actually do work.
And there are successful examples of this having been done in other
China. I mean, one of the most commonly used anti-malarial treatments today actually traces its origin to Chinese traditional medicine. But the Chinese went about it in a scientific way. And they isolated the active ingredient, ran tests on it, and then developed the medicine.
But may I just add, if you are using a herb, identifying and extracting the active ingredient, studying it in cell models, and then subsequently in animal models, and then subsequently on humans in a phased series of trials, it ceases to be an Ayurvedic preparation. It transitions into modern medicine.
Absolutely.
Right.
It's a branding issue.
It's evidence-based medicine.
I mean, until we can get Ayush medicines to adopt these standards, to meet the rigorous standards of safety and efficacy that we require of other modern medicines, is the answer then to regulate how the kinds of claims they make?
Yes,
Prashant?
absolutely. So again, God bless that same Parliamentary Standing Committee on Health. It's a fantastic set of parliamentarians over there. They went after the Ministry of Health because they kept seeing different kinds of AYUSH drugs making crazy claims. Now, traditionally, these AYUSH guys, as long as they remained in the realm of, nutritional supplements, etc., nobody really bothered. But these guys are getting into diabetes, AIDS, cancer cures, etc., malaria. Yeah. So the government, because the Ministry of AYUSH was then split away from the Ministry of Health, the bureaucracy was under so much pressure that they did come out with a rule finally saying that you can no longer advertise AYUSH drugs as making certain therapeutic claims unless we approve it. And that rule was then promptly challenged before the Delhi High Court. And the people challenging the rule are, Reckitt Bensinker and some Italian company, apart from the AYUSH, Ayurveda ecosystem. So this is like a holy mix of capitalism and nationalism and, traditional knowledge. And the Delhi High Court's been sitting on this case now for 3.5 years. But this is a case that's going to go all the way to the Supreme Court because they'll have to relook an old 1954 precedent in Hamdard Dawakhana on whether
Commercial speech.
commercial speech is covered under the fundamental right to expression. And it would be great, Dhvani, if your team could file an amicus brief in the in the court.
And see, this is very interesting because this whole obsession with promoting AYUSH medicine and propagating AYUSH cures comes from some sense of insecurity about national insecurity about our ancient forms of knowledge, indigenous wisdom. And towards the end in your book, you speak about how any exposure of a failure in our drug regulatory system is seen not as, is not seen in the way in which the 59th report of the Standing Committee saw it, but as a conspiracy to destabilize the Indian pharmaceutical industry, as an anti-national sort of, measure. So why do we have this kind of defensive attitude towards pharmaceutical regulation? I mean, I'm sure recalls, withdrawals happen in other jurisdictions as well. In fact, it's a symptom of the fact that the regulatory system is working. So why is it that we are unable to see these problems, recognize this as a public health issue and take steps to address it? So I think on that note, I'll get closing remarks from all of you and then maybe we can open this up to the audience for questions.
Yeah, you're right. And this goes back even to the UPA years. This is not exclusively a NDA BJP issue, where somehow the pharmaceutical industry is seen as some kind of holy sacred cow. Because I think one of the reasons is because it's one of the few manufacturing success stories that India has, and the government does not want to see it tarnished. So any critics of that, the government's regulatory moves does meet with the pushback of your vested interests, etc., and like Dinesh has felt the brunt of it, so I'll hand over the mic to him on that count.
No, look, I guess it goes with the territory, right? I mean, they're very protective of the industry, and I understand that. I think I've been called an anti-national by the former DCGI on the record, which is fine. It goes with the territory. But the point here is this, right? We have this industry that actually is very valuable. The US healthcare depends on medicines from India. If Indian medicines weren't there, the US healthcare will collapse, right? That's a fact. I'm not saying anything that's outrageous here. The fact is that there's a better way to fix this thing. We don't want news reports being printed in Bloomberg saying a US FDA inspector came in and found that we were shedding documents. It doesn't tell us, it doesn't give a good impression to the world that we know what we are doing, right? It gives impression that somehow we're committing fraud. Why do we do this? We have a good industry. Let's fix, the regulation that governs this industry, make it better. It could be so much better than what it is right now. The reputation in the industry is tarnished not by people like me, but their own actions. And if you can fix that, there's so much opportunity in here, both economically, to provide jobs to our young people. We can do this right. But you need to first admit that we have a problem and find a way to fix it.
Yeah, and I'll say this again. Where should your loyalty lie as the drug regulator? Should it be with your own brothers and sisters, your fellow countrymen and women, your little children? Where does nationalistic piety come into this at all? Is it not a dull conscience that mourns injury to national pride rather than injury to the organ systems of little children and the deaths of little children? Thomas Paine once wrote in a completely different context, in mourning the plumage, we forgot about the dying bird. And let me say that there's been this consistent effort at trying to say that activists and intellectuals in particular, and sort of urban naxos, manipulated by vested interests, have a project of harming the great esteem and rank and honor of our great country. And if I'm allowed to tell a story, the origin of the word intellectual comes from the late 19th century, from the Alfred Dreyfus affair. He was a French military captain, and he was accused of treason and selling of state secrets to the Germans, and he was quickly convicted in a closed court and then sentenced to rigorous life imprisonment in a fortified prison. But there was a group of people who thought that evidence against him had been fabricated and he was falsely implicated, and this movement grew. And forensic evidence was unearthed to say that, this has been a complete fabrication. And then the greater good of the nation state was invoked to suppress reopening of the case. And this kind of convulsed French society and divided it into two groups, the pro-Dreyfusards and the anti-Dreyfusards. And the term intellectual rapidly gained common currency as a term of abuse. What it meant, it was used to mock the pro-Dreyfusards. They said, these people are poisoned spirits. They have no rootedness in the culture and glory of the fatherland. They have no loyalty to our pride, our blood and soil. The only loyalty they have is to the mind, to the intellect, and therefore intellectual. And it was used as a term of abuse. The only loyalty they have is to skeptical inquiry. And I think, I must say that your kind of skeptical inquiry, the one that Prashant, Reddy and Dinesh Thakur and many other journalists like Priyanka Pulla have been so fiercely combative and have been fighting the highest authority in the land, I think this kind of disruptive skepticism, their zealots, their interventions, I think should be celebrated. And these are precisely the sort of intellectuals we need.
Thank you very much. Anyone in the audience who wants to? Their intellectual credentials. Maybe we'll take 2 or 3 questions at a time and then answer.
This side, yeah. Hi. 2 quick questions. First, I'm sure the book was released just a week back. So, is there any opposition expressed from the pharmaceutical lobby, say Indian Pharmaceutical Alliance, or from the likes of the CDSCO? Number 1. Number 2, is there any reluctance from any of the leading publishers to publish this book? Because the book is again fighting the system.
Yeah, Professor Aurora.
I must congratulate you. This is a much needed light. Light is the greatest sanitizer, and I think that we absolutely need a book like this at a time when we proclaim that we want to be the pharmacy of the world and so on. Now, I have 2 questions. One is that regulators need to be regulated. One of the ways regulators can be regulated is by benchmarking them against regulators of other countries. So the Election Commission has other election commissioners, the Controller and Auditor General has other controller and auditor general. You've said clearly that the WHO, a UN organization, and I don't want to comment on how it functioned during the pandemic, is bound by state sovereignty and can't divulge. So, do we have a professional organization against which the Indian regulator can be judged? So that is my first question. The second question is, how does the money flow in this? I presume it is under GST and so it's all pooled together, but is there a state share and a central share? Because manufacturing is in Himachal Pradesh or in a few other areas. So what is the state interest, financial interest in production units?
Should we just answer both of these? I'm going to forget them otherwise. So for the first question, I mean, I think the pharma industry is still reading the book. We haven't heard anything from them, but I can assure you, I don't think it'll be very good. As for the publishers, I mean, we were lucky enough. I don't know if Himanjali is here, but Simon and Schuster, they jumped at the book as soon as we discussed it with them last year. So we're very grateful to them that they've taken this up because this is a bit of a high-risk book. To answer Professor Arora's questions on how exactly, is the Indian regulator accountable, to whom it's accountable, etc. I think one of the very surprising discoveries when we were researching for this is the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Health. It doesn't get enough coverage in the press, but they actually do a fantastic job. So this is a standing committee where generally all the MPs who are doctors are sent to this committee, and a lot of them have done a great job over the last few years. But that said, yes, I think there is still room for more accountability measures for the national regulator. And one of the things that Dinesh and me have been writing about in context of a new law that the government proposed to replace the Drugs and Cosmetics Act is that we need to look at democratizing regulation itself. For example, look at the right to information, right to participation, equip a citizen with enough information, and provide them with a legal pathway to challenge regulatory decisions. Because every time Dinesh wants to give an input to the regulator, we usually end up going to court, which shouldn't be the only measure. As for a national benchmark, for an international benchmark, I mean, I think we'd still have
WHO.
yeah, but I think like the US FDA does a pretty good job on many counts, especially on transparency. The WHO does have some stuff, but yeah, even I don't think I'm very confident about it. You have anything to add?
It's all fine in theory, but
Yeah.
it doesn't really
It
work
lacks
in
the
practice.
teeth. Yeah. So regarding your second question on the budget for national and state regulators are funded out of the state government's treasury. So there's no question of sharing revenue, etc. So whoever, whatever the general budget is for the year, they allocate a certain amount to the state government. To the state regulator. The center at times has come out with centrally sponsored schemes, etc., to help build up capacity. But that's something that we haven't really looked into. But those are, specifically for building labs or some capital investment that is required in enhancing capacity. But the usual budget just comes out of the state treasury. I hope I've answered your question.
The proceeds of the sales of medicine, how does that go into the exchequer, and is it partly into the state exchequer, partly into the central?
That I haven't looked at. So I think central excise generally manufacturing goes to the government.
So
now with GST,
This, I think
even
the
that
GST
is
would take
this
care
thing,
of that.
yeah.
Sorry.
So
Hi. That was a terrific discussion. I had a very simple, Mumbai kind of question. that all this discussion is terrific and we need to know about it. But as a non-expert on this subject, when a doctor recommends a medicine, be it a branded one or a generic one, how do I decide whether to consume it or not? So,
Right now, there's no information, but I'll let Dinesh really scare you.
No. No, I mean, I think maybe Dr. Satwik will say, but I just say my 2 words. I think we don't have a consolidated database where you can actually go check for the quality of medicine or the quality of the company. We just don't have that. Other countries do, like the US FDA. You can actually go check, if there've been recalls, has the inspection been done of a company's manufacturing facility, what have they found, that kind of stuff. But most doctors, and I'm not going to speak for Dr. Satwik, he'll say something. I think over a period of time, they develop confidence in certain brands and certain manufacturers. This is what my experience is. They know which ones work. They know which ones don't work. And typically what they do is stick with the ones that they work because that's what their clinical experience is. This is what our research says. I don't have a good answer.
Yeah, that's true. The Maiden Pharma, the one that was incriminated or is being incriminated, is like an ISO 9001 whatever company, certified company. Anyway, so first clue would be, is it a good brand? Because humans are reputational animals. And the idea that Apple is going to sell you a dud is highly unlikely because they've got their own reputation. Reputations are built over long periods of time and they're lost very, very quickly. But as I just pointed out, that it's entirely possible that your branded manufacturer might be subcontracting the production of the drug to some facility somewhere in a DDA flat. So, who knows? But I think most doctors tend to do this empirically, that they know that these are the brands that are working. And therefore, the trouble is that there are good practice guidelines. Our Prime Minister wants us to write generics. It's very difficult. They don't inspire confidence.
And if I can add to that, when in 2017, Prime Minister Modi had announced this policy, if you remember, that he's going to force all doctors to write only the names of the generics. And a lot of doctors responded saying that's not possible. And as usual, they were painted as, corrupt people who are more interested in incentives from the pharma lobby. But legally speaking, in the US, there's something called this Orange Book, where the US FDA certifies that the generic is equivalent and interchangeable with the innovator drug. The government of India does not give doctors that legal guarantee. So until they are able to give doctors that legal guarantee, they should not be allowed to force doctors to issue prescriptions only in the generic name.
I remember once writing an antibiotic and it was substituted by the pharmacist, and the brand that they sent back was something called Zyka. And I looked at the address of where this is manufactured on Google Maps. It was right next to the Najafgarh Nala.
Yeah, my question is on regulation. Yeah, I think it's across areas that regulation has become a bad word. And it seems like regulation is equal to inspector is equal to corruption. So regulation is bad, ease of doing business is good. So the question is really about thinking about how do we flip this to try and ensure that regulation by design is seen as a good thing that is necessary both for quality, efficacy, consumer interest, and also, if you want it, national pride, because at the end of the day, certainly no one wants an Indian company or any other company in the world manufacturing cough syrup that's contaminated. So maybe we can take it at 3 levels. One is a constant thread that I thought ran through Dr. Satwik's points, which is about national character. I mean, I think that's a kind of much larger question, that why does the pharma company that made this cough syrup with contaminant not think about the fact that this is going to kill someone who's going to be somebody's child? I guess that's at that level. But at a sort of more at a level that's easier to grasp, what are the incentives and disincentives that we can put in place to try and ensure that kinds of regulation that are necessary for quality, that are necessary for safety, are not the baby that's thrown out with the bathwater of thinking regulation's a bad word. So what are the kinds of incentives and disincentives that we can think about?
The first thing, Orgo, that I think we should look at is, and we should ask ourselves, because there's enough data right now, what is the cost of failure, right? 2020 in Jammu, we had 11 children die, and then 8 months later, this 2-year-old Radhika died. What is the cost of that failure, right, to that company? Has that company actually faced anything meaningful in terms of punitive repercussions from the state, right? Until we begin to think in those terms, this is always going to be chalked up as cost of doing business, right? Yes, we will outrage for a couple of days. It'll play up on the news televisions, we'll have a couple of, evening debates and stuff like that, and then we'll go back to doing what we're doing right now. Where is the cost of actually, doing this kind of nonsense? And it's not the first time, right? DEG poisoning in our country's history, 5 times. 5 times. Where is the cost to the manufacturer? And unless we do that, it's going to be chalked up to cost of doing business. Yes, it's bad PR for, a week. You can certainly buy a full page ad in Hindustan Times and change the name of your company, and you're going to be back in business in no time.
Yeah, I guess the incentives are going to, the main incentive is going to be to remain competitive in the international market. I think that's the only message that the government will understand. And it's only a matter of time before, countries like Vietnam, Bangladesh beat us at this game, because making generic pharmaceutical medicines is not even that difficult. You can still do it. So it's only a matter of time before they beat us to it. So if that's one way the government wants to look at it, then yes, you're going to lose your export markets very quickly. And for example, you kill 66 children in Africa, trust me, they're not going to forget that. They are going to be long-term repercussions for that. So let's see. From a public health perspective, ideally, which should be the lens through which we're looking at this situation, I just don't think the bureaucracy understands, because this is like climate change, right? You can't see a lot of this stuff happen because a lot of these cases, children will not actually die. Instead, you won't be treated properly. There'll be complications. Doctors will not even know that you've died because of the medicine sometimes. It's very difficult to convey the consequences of bad medicine to policymakers who are not conversant in that field. So if they understand money, then let's tell them that the export markets are going to go.
So I have 2 questions. One regarding the prevention of preventing from something happening that goes wrong, and 2, taking action when something goes wrong. So basically, I would like to comment you on Indian pharmacopoeia. What do you think? Is it exhaustive enough in its current state? And as it came out through, this extensive reportage on Remdesivir by Priyanka Pulla, that, currently Indian pharmacopoeia doesn't even have standards for different kinds of, new drugs and tests. And 2, even if there are certain standards, a lot of time regulators get away with not applying them due to certain reasons. So what is the way forward to fix it? And 2, about recalls. Basically, I think when something goes wrong, the first thing you should do is recall a particular batch of drugs. But I think that's the last thing that our regulators think about and sort of come up with all sorts of excuses for that. So if you could give an example from other regulators across the world, that how do they go about recalling bad batches?
Okay, I'll just answer the recall question and give it to Dinesh for the pharmacopoeia question. So yes, even after this incident in Gambia, where 66 children died, what we were asking for, we had written a piece in the Economic Times saying that the government's response should be a public health-oriented response. Don't worry about the reputation of the industry or the company. Your immediate aim should be to ensure that other products of that particular company don't kill anybody else. Because the preliminary report suggested that this company wasn't testing any of its input material for contamination. So all the government's response again was that no, these 4 brands are being sold abroad, they're not being sold in India. Fine, that may be true, but they were selling other cough syrups in India, right? So this public health issue, looking at recalls through a public health lens, is something the government has been struggling with. And for the book, we found an incident from starting from 1976, where a health secretary flagged this and said that, a drug being recalled from one state is being sold in another state after it failed quality testing. And since 1976, every decade it comes up a couple of times. And till date, we don't have a national drug recall law, which is just shocking because we have such a fragmented system of regulation where each state drug regulator is doing its own tests. So even if they recall it in their own state, it's not enough. You have to recall it from across the board. And to go back to the Jammu incident, 11 children died in January 2020. By February 2020, I think Dinesh had written a piece, highlighting to the government that conduct a transparent recall so that more children don't die. In August, a 2-year-old is admitted to the same hospital where the 11 children died. And since the doctors there were aware of this company, they saw its brand, they saw the cough syrup. It was a different brand manufactured by the same company. And they notified the CDSCO, but the 2-year-old child had died by then. So this is something that the government doesn't want to do, is our hypothesis, because recalls typically across the world are also accompanied by mass communications, mass publicity. The idea is to get the word out there to every doctor and every patient. And just imagine if the government of India had to issue a recall notice for every drug that failed testing. Like according to our information, the last decade, about 12,000 samples have failed testing just in about 4 states, plus the central labs. We couldn't get information from a lot of other states. Now just imagine if you as a common person or as a doctor heard about over 12,000 recall notices over the last decade. You would be terrified and you'd start asking for accountability for the drug regulator. If you want to answer the pharma.
Right. So just so that, those of you who don't get into the weeds of the pharmacopoeia, it's essentially a government body that sets standards, right? So anytime you do testing, you have to test against that standard, right? It's just like when you go buy, vegetables in the grocery store, they have a standard against which they measure a kilo of vegetables, right? That standard is certified by the Indian Standards Institute. That's how you know it weighs a kilo or half a kilo or whatever it is, right? It's exactly the same thing Indian Pharmacopoeia does. It basically defines the standard and also provides what are called reference standards because against which testing has to be done. Indian Pharmacopoeia is lacking in significant quantities in both of those areas. In the book, we actually get into the issue around availability of reference standards because remember, the state drug labs need that 1 kilo thing, right? To say, this is what a kilo looks like, or this is what a 500 milligrams look like when you're testing against it. We document thoroughly in our book how on multiple occasions, state drug controllers keep complaining about the fact that we cannot get standards from the Indian Pharmacopoeia, right? And so a lot of this testing that is being done, they actually go back to the company and say, can you give us your standard?
Yeah, and to add to that, so we clearly have documented instances from these official government meetings where they say, where their drug controllers on the record saying we're not getting reference standards in time, which is why there's a delay. And the moment there's a delay in testing, sometimes cases get thrown out when you want to prosecute. And so we file an RTI with the Pharmacopoeia Commission asking them that, have you received any complaints about delays? And they say, no, we haven't received any such complaints. So we don't know who's lying to us and why there's no communication. But one of the reasons possibly that those committees don't really take this up with the Indian Pharmacopoeia Commission is that the chairperson of the Indian Pharmacopoeia Commission is the health secretary, the IS officer. So the drug consultative committee, which consists of underlings, is most likely not going to file an official complaint on the record against a body headed by their boss. And hence we have this unholy situation where the basic standard setting body is not working. I mean, the entire revolution in drug regulation in the early 20th century was all about standardization. Without standardization, there is no concept of standard quality.
Last questions, no? Yeah.
So parallel to reforming the regulatory process, what about victims suing for crores of rupees in damages in consumer courts so that the cost of providing substandard drugs becomes prohibitive?
It's very hard to prove that, right?
Yeah, well, in a lot of cases, it's very difficult to even prove it because, for example, if an antibiotic has only 20%, chances are that you as a consumer won't even know that it has only 20% of the active ingredient. you have to get it tested, etc., which is a complicated issue. Even in cases where people die, even then, like if you look at the way the legal system works, it could take a very long time. But yes, theoretically, that is a possibility that is open to correct the industry actions.
There's only one question. One more question.
Sir, I wanted to ask about this compulsory licensing. There is a concept, compulsory licensing. That is not a drug. But compulsory licensing is being given during the patent period?
We can discuss that later, sir. It's not a drug regulatory concept. I'll talk to you about it later after the
One more question.
Hello, sir. This has been it's been a revelation for me because as a junior resident, first thing is if an antibiotic doesn't work, the training that we have got is do a culture, put a higher antibiotic, and then the next day they're going to kill us with differential diagnosis because we are willing to change a diagnosis, but we will never be, that has never come across our mind. And I want to know, is this just an Indian thing or is this how medicos work all around the world? That is one. And number two is we have MR people coming and asking us. And yeah, they give the basic data. This is how much clinical trials and all. But now you're saying terms like recalls and court cases. Like, what are the questions should we ask them? Like, how many court cases have you been sued? Like, because I don't know, like, what are the questions we need to ask an MR before?
No, I think first of all, don't believe anything and everything that the medical representatives tell you, because a lot of this could be just victorious proclamations, which may or may not have anything to do with the product. I mean, the book outlines how the Parliamentary Standing Committee earmarked this drug called buclazine, which is basically an antihistaminic, but was being promoted, marketed, and sold in India as an appetite stimulant for children without any evidence, with zero evidence. And the drug regulator had approved this. So just because you're being shown a flyer that says that, this is what we think the drug does, I think you should, I'm not a Marxist, but perhaps the only motto that Marx propagated, which fascinates me, is de omnibus dubitandum, doubt everything, be suspicious of everything.
And if I'm not mistaken, these kinds of promotional material are not covered by the drugs and magic remedies objectionable advertisement act, right? They don't.
Yeah, there's an exemption for that.
Yeah, so then doubly don't believe them.
There is zero legal liability if they misrepresent the facts of the case.
Exactly.
Hi,
that's our last question. Yes.
Thank you. I just wanted to sort of latch on to what Prashant said and Dr. Satwik said about mass communication and Zyka. So then basically whenever in environmental pollution cases, if there's some like deaths of 50 people in a particular area due to some kind of a accident, then we get very clear reportage on, say, what company did this, what happened. There's a lot of at least conversation about what happened, and investigation after that happens, even like criminal prosecution happens. But in this case, where there is a case of active harm, we still talk about generics as if like, there's this sort of amorphous angel who's making these drugs, and we don't know, we don't name anybody, we don't talk about who's doing it. We sort of shift the conversation to the regulator, which I suppose it's important in its own place, but why don't we talk more about corporate liability or who is actually liable? I'm just not able to grasp it.
My explanation is that a large part of the pharma industry just has no moral compass. These are people who can't be shamed into reforming themselves. So we go after the people who are accountable to us, which is the regulator and the government. But I don't know, maybe Dinesh has a more optimistic answer to that.
No, so here's the thing, right? So I look at the behavior of the company in India versus the United States, right? Even in the US, there have been multi-billion-dollar judgments against pharma companies for off-label use, right? It's a different kind of crime compared to what happens here. But the fact remains is that in order to prove culpability, you have to have a standard against which you have to measure the crime, right? Off-label use is very easy to prove because you know that you're supposed to prescribe this particular medicine to these kind of patients, right? This is the standard dose that is available to you. If you're pushing 4 times that dose, it's very easy to kind of, nail it down. It's very difficult here to say if your azithromycin that's been prescribed to you has 20% or 30% of active ingredient and it doesn't work, your fever doesn't go down, you go back to your primary care physician, chances are that primary care physician is going to flip that prescription and give you another prescription saying azithromycin is not working, I'll give you erythromycin, right? There is no incentive or the process for us to investigate why that is not happening, right? In the US, associated with a medical license is a requirement that healthcare providers call up an 800 number and say, I have a patient here saying that the medication is not working. It's a part of the renewal of medical license. Every 2 years, you look at how many cases that have you reported. If you're a health registered medical LPN or a physician. Now, tell me, Dr. Satwik, how many times do we actually report?
If I were to encounter an adverse event, severe or non-severe, as a consequence of administering a substance, I have no way of establishing whether this is an idiosyncratic reaction to the molecule or to the particular brand or preparation that was administered. And I have no idea about how I can go about assaying the drug, and where I send the sample, what my legal rights here are. And I asked Prashant and Dinesh this question last night, and they said they haven't a clue. And this just gives you an idea about the bleakness of the situation.
Yeah, I think your next book has to be on pharmacovigilance and adverse event reporting. I mean, thank you, everyone. This has been a really eye-opening discussion, as it should be, as I think the intent was. For me, there was one particular anecdote in the book that really stayed with me. I mean, you've talked about how one of the parents of the children who died in Jammu was so anguished that he set his house on fire. I think our house is on fire. The drug regulatory system is in a shambles. Unless every one of us feels this kind of anguish, I don't think there's going to be the kind of change that we should want to see. And on that note, I think it's very important that everyone read this book and learn for themselves how important it is to care about this issue. It's been a wonderful discussion. Thank you, Dr. Satwik. Thank you, Prashant and Dinesh, and to the audience for coming and spending this evening here. I think there are more copies of the book outside. Yeah, great. Thanks and good evening, everyone.